We'll get started in about 1 minute here. If you haven't yet, go ahead and take our little poll. It's not as elaborate as the poll we're going to be talking about today, but just gives us an idea of who's coming.
Analysis is a lot quicker.
Yeah, this will be a cakewalk. Thank you to whoever hit record.
Hey.
Well, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started here. Am I coming up on video? Yes, I am. Okay. I'm Cassandra Brown. I'm the program manager with the Ohio State Offer Program, and I'd like to welcome you all, those who are joining us live and those who will be watching our recording at a later time. So this is the first in a series of organic themed webinars we're hosting this winter, and you can find out more about that at offer.osu.edu. And we do have a few additional webinars under construction, including one on cover crops on January 6th. So a few quick reminders as we get started. This is a webinar, but it is set up as a meeting. We're hoping to have some time for questions and comments and discussion at the end. You can use the chat feature to post a question during the presentation, and I'll kind of keep an eye on that. But we do ask that you keep your microphone mute during the presentation, and I will keep an eye on that as well. So if you're joining us by telephone and you get muted by me, the way to unmute yourself is *6. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers for today. Kicking off our webinar series, we have a sampling of the fine resources Ohio State has in its School of Environment and Natural Resources. Doug Jackson Smith hails from many places. He's worked in Utah, California, New York, Wisconsin, Nepal, and Indonesia, and looking for something a little more exotic, where he works at the OARDC facility. He has a background in sociology, rural sociology, and agricultural economics. He's listed on the website as a professor of water security, but his work covers a broad range of topics and disciplines. He enjoys focusing on the human factor in research, including participatory research and how human behaviors interact with policies, models, and systems. We also have with us today Shoshana Inwood, and she is also a rural sociologist. She has a background in environmental science and biology. And like our first speaker, her research covers a range of topics, focusing mainly on the role of communities and households in American agriculture and food systems. Her current work includes community-based economic development through food and agriculture, social and community factors affecting farm growth and development, and the persistence of agriculture at the rural-urban interface. Our third speaker, Andrea Rissing, has a background in cultural anthropology. She joined Ohio State this past summer, specifically to work on the Ohio Farm Poll. Her previous work focused on beginning farmers in Iowa and their diverse livelihood strategies. So we're very pleased to have these three with us today to share some results from the recent Ohio Farm Poll, and I will turn it over to them.
Excellent. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to do this kind of as a team presentation. So I'll be handing off sections. Again, I'm Doug Jackson Smith. I'm a professor here based in Worcester. I am a sociologist, but I've worked with people all across the board. But a lot of my work focuses on engaging with farmers. So that might mean doing on-farm research, but also we've or throughout my career, collected data from farmers in a lot of different ways to help us understand what's going on farms, what's driving the decisions that farmers are making, and what are some of the issues that are on farmers' minds that we might be able to raise the profile of in policy and research communities. So much of my career, I've been a bridge, or tried to fill the niche between what I'm hearing out in the field and some of the things happening in research. Now, a lot of my extension colleagues do that same work in a lot of different ways. I'm not based in a county out there every day with farmers, and so we're excited to share the results of a recent major statewide survey that we did and talk about what some of the implications of that might be for all of our work. So today we're going to talk about the results of the 2020 Ohio Farm Poll, and I'll give you a little bit of background on that poll, but we're going to really zero in on the results that we designed to highlight findings for the organic farming community. And part of the way we designed this is that we really oversampled organic farms so that we could compare and understand the experiences organic industry actors are having, and that'll be the focus of our talk today primarily. So a little bit of background to the project. If you worked in a cave in 2018 and 2019, you'll know that those were really wet years and really difficult years in Ohio. Trade wars, price declines, weather stress. And so we got involved in campus conversations about how to better understand what's going on out there in the landscape and get some good data that can help guide OSU's response. A couple of questions that we were concerned about is not just what was going on in the here and now, but how does this fit into a longer term pattern of change and transformation in Ohio agriculture, and really how different subsectors of Ohio agriculture were affected differently by those same stressors. In particular, like I said, we wanted to see how organic farms were doing relative to conventional farms. Quick plug for a background document. I won't talk much about it, but we did last year in winter develop a historical report that's available on a couple of websites, but a link is on here through our school that can give you some compilations of agricultural census data and other data sources that capture the trends over the last 20 years in Ohio agriculture. Some themes are that things are in some ways the same. We have the same number of farms almost identically that we had 20 years ago, a slight decline in acres, but what's happened within the sector has been an awful lot of churning and transformation, specialization of production, concentration of production, the rise in both large and small farms, and aging population, themes you probably all know about, but if you're interested, please pursue that. I will just plug this, noting that it doesn't go into detail at all on organic farming. That's something we're doing as a separate document. All right, so the 2020 Farm Poll focuses on 2019. It went out in the spring of this year, and we didn't know that COVID was coming, but it gave us an opportunity to really get some systematic and scientifically valid data on what was going on in agriculture and exploring differences by region, farm type, farm size, and how farms market. We designed the survey with input from a lot of our partners, probably many of whom are here on the webinar, and then implemented the survey with the farm community between February and May. We drew a random sample of 2,500 farms, got a 41% response rate. It's a fairly detailed survey, so that's quite a high response rate. We think it's representative and authoritative. We also did a separate random sample of 500 certified organic farmers. It's roughly half of the organic farming sector in Ohio, in order to get enough responses to really say some things about what's going on in the organic industry. We got a 56% response rate on this one, and again, feel like it's a really good scientific cross-section of what's going on in organic farmers. And this is the stuff we'll focus mainly on in our presentation today. Just to give you a feel of who our respondents are, in the organic sample, about half the respondents came from the northeastern region of the Ohio Agricultural Extension System, with other representation across the other 4 regions. This is not surprising to those who work with organic farmers that there's a very high concentration in the Northeast, but it also documents the significant footprint throughout the state. Organic farms in our respondent pool were predominantly dairy, specialty crop, and cash gain operations, though we did have some beef, poultry, and hog livestock farms as well, and a few hay operations. Just for comparison, our conventional farm sample was much more dominated by cash grains and other livestock, with smaller dairy and specialty crop, as you'd think or expect in the state of Ohio. Most of our organic farm respondents farmed at a pretty significant commercial scale, more than $50,000 of gross receipts a year, although a third are in what we consider a pretty small farm category. Compared to conventional farms, though, the organic farm sample has much larger shares in the larger commercial sales category. And this is a reminder that across the state in general, farms tend to be very small in Ohio, at least the way we define farms in work like this. But the organic sector, much more dominated by relatively larger operations. The farm sample, the age of the farm respondents among the organic sample had about 2/3 under the age of 55. And if you know anything about Ohio agriculture, that's not typical. In fact, among our conventional sample, over 70% of our respondents were over the age of 55. And so we know that the organic sector is dominated by comparatively younger operators. We asked some questions about the use of direct marketing. And in our organic sample overall, about a quarter of them reported the use of direct markets selling directly to consumers. That was much more prevalent among the organic specialty crop growers and some of the other livestock growers than dairy and cash grains, as you would expect. So finally, we noticed in our previous work with organic farmers in Ohio that many identified as Amish, Mennonite, or some conservative community. And we used some information to estimate the farmers that we think are likely, and it's not a lock, Amish, Mennonite, and other conservative farmers. Overall, about 64% of the respondents in our organic pool are likely to be a conservative plain farmer. That's a very high number. It's the same number we got 2 years ago when we surveyed organic farmers that grew corn in Ohio and looked at the proportion in Ohio that use horses as their mode of traction. So there's some confirmation of these numbers, but we know we've got a big presence, and we aren't going to unpack all that for you today. It's particularly true in dairy, but true across the board. Finally, we asked some questions about whether these farms have any land transitioning into organics, and about a quarter of the organic sample said that they have additional land that's in transition, but only 4% of the conventional statewide sample. I will note that 4% of 77,000 farms, though, is a much bigger number than 25% of 1,000 organic farms. So we know that the bigger proportion of people bringing land in are not currently certified organic. So that's a backdrop on the survey methodology and who we have answers from. The rest of this is going to focus on what they told us. And we're going to start with the core question of what happened to farms in 2019. I'll hand it over to Andrea.
Thanks. Yeah, so what happened in 2019? What was actually going on organic farms in Ohio? For this section, I'm going to start at a pretty high level and then drill down into a few of the specific areas that we asked about. So just to start out, we asked everyone to rate on a 3-point scale how business conditions were on their farms in 2019. And it won't be a surprise to anybody on this call, 2019 was a pretty tough year. So 59% of organic farmers said that 2019 conditions were worse than usual, and about 40% said that it was about the same as usual, and very few said that it was better than usual. And when we compared these results to our random sample of primarily conventional farmers, we see that it looks almost exactly the same. So it was a tough year across the board. Looking into some of the specific shocks that happened during 2019 that created those tough business conditions, we see, again, unsurprisingly, that last year's rains were a really big part of the story. Almost 80% of organic farms had to delay planting because of rain last year. But other shocks were showing up as well. So a little over half reported a significant drop in crop yields, and about a third saw a decline in the prices that they received for their products. Smaller numbers of farmers also reported a major pest or disease outbreak or a health crisis as a shock that they experienced. This question is also a really good example of where splitting out types of farms can be really illustrative. So when we break down our respondents by farm type, we start to see that not everyone experienced 2019 the same way. So for example, if we look at our organic cash grain farms, which are the yellow bar on this slide, 80% of them had to delay planting, and 2/3 of them had lower yields. On the other hand, specialty crop and dairy farmers, the blue and purple columns, were the two groups more likely to experience lower prices. So you can really see the impact of the milk price crisis last year. And then similarly, if we split out the pest and disease problems shock, that shows that it was mostly a stress that was experienced by specialty crop, by organic specialty crop producers. About a third of those respondents said that was a big shock for them. One other group that we broke out were organic farms that direct marketed, and we found that that group was somewhat slightly insulated from price drops last year. So we had 74 farms who direct marketed any product. So they weren't necessarily exclusively direct marketing, but if they had any direct marketing on their farm, and they were a bit less likely to report lower prices in 2019 compared to those who sold exclusively into commodity markets. So about 35% in the group that only used conventional markets, and 30% in the group that had some direct marketing on their farm reported price drops. Looking at the frequency of shocks, overall, what we found is that organic farms experienced more shocks than conventional farms. So we're almost 2/3 of organic farmers had to delay planting, about 56% of conventional farmers reported that. And we see similar patterns in who experienced yield drops and increases in pest and disease problems. Organic farmers were more likely to report both of those. The one exception here is drop in prices, which was a little bit more frequently experienced by conventional farmers. So that's kind of the snapshot of what happened, but how stressful did farmers actually find these events? What was actually causing them stress last year? So first, we're going to look at the major sources of stress that organic farmers reported. Weather was unsurprisingly the top stressor. Half of organic farmers said that weather was a major stressor. And the second biggest stressor was farmland costs. But then after those two, what jumps out is this kind of third tier of stressors. Right around 20 to 25% of organic farmers said that all of these things, farm input costs, market prices, healthcare costs, retirement savings, farm debt load, and thinking about the future of their farm, were major stressors. So we're kind of thinking of this third tier as poor farm economy plus healthcare costs. And we see that as a cause of farm stress, affording healthcare was really neck and neck with the stress of market prices or farm debt for what was stressing out farmers last year. Fees results are also really interesting. So we saw a few slides back that organic farmers were more likely than conventional farmers to experience the major shocks of 2019. But what we see here is that they usually experienced less stress, even with higher shock levels. So these results come from a section of our survey that listed stressors and asked farmers to rate on a 5-point scale how much stress it caused them during 2019. And this slide is showing how many respondents in each sample reported that a stressor was either a 4 or a 5 stressor. So whereas 35% of conventional farmers found market prices very stressful, only 25% of organic farmers did, where 23% of conventional farmers found trade policies very stressful, only 10% of organic farmers did. The one exception to that pattern was stress caused by disease and pests, the second to last column cluster, where organic farmers were a little bit more likely to be stressed by those. We also wanted to understand how farmers were responding to those stresses, to the stressful year. So we asked them a long list of questions about what changes they made in 2019. The fully dark blue bars are changes that they made on farms, and the lighter blue bars are changes made in households. And the one green bar is positive adaptation. So folks who reported investing in new machinery or new buildings. Everything else is something like delaying or postponing or reducing something. So if you start at the bottom, the most commonly reported change was reducing expenditures on farm inputs, followed by postponing major household purchases and using household savings to meet expenses, and then postponing major farm purchases. And about a third of organic farms reported making those changes. So these results together, I think, can be read as showing how a stressful farm business year can also stress out farm households. And they also attest to the resiliency of Ohio farm households, as they can be flexible and nimble and kind of mobilized to help buffer business shocks from the farm economy. The last section that I'm going to go over is farmers' satisfaction with their farm operations and with their quality of life. So this image is showing the aspects of farm operations that farmers were most and least satisfied with. So people reported being most satisfied with their level of independence, the first column being able to be my own boss, and they're least satisfied with the more financial issues, net farm income and how much inputs cost. And in the middle range, farmers were also satisfied with how much time they had to spend with their families and their market access. It's more of a mixed bag for how satisfied farmers were with the physical demands of farm work and their yields, and then starting to get into feeling less satisfied with the prices that they receive for commodities, their net farm inputs, their net farm income, and the cost of farm inputs. And the rightmost column shows satisfaction with the overall farm operation, and 44% said that they were satisfied or very satisfied overall. This slide is like a similar analysis, but for quality of life instead of farm operation. And it's a similar story. Farmers were very satisfied with their personal relationships, with their partners, with their children, with their neighbors, and reported less satisfaction with their disposable household income. That was the thing that they expressed the most dissatisfaction with. And satisfaction with time off from the farm is more in the middle. 44% of farmers were satisfied with their time off, and 21% were dissatisfied with the big group in the middle. And at a general level, we found organic farmers reported being quite satisfied with their overall quality of life. 85% were satisfied or very satisfied with the kind of life that farming affords them. And then here we're comparing organic and conventional farmers and how satisfied they are. And organic farmers reported being more satisfied with basically all aspects of their farm operations. So ability to be my own boss, access to markets, prices they received, and overall farm operation. Organic farmers were more satisfied with all of those. Commodity prices really jumps out. I was just going to pull out commodity prices here because organic farmers were almost twice as likely to be satisfied with the prices they received as conventional farms. And then this is a parallel comparison here for quality of life satisfaction between organic and conventional farmers. And overall, what we see is that everyone's more satisfied with aspects of the farm household than with their farm operations. And within that, organic operators are even more satisfied. The one small exception being satisfaction with time off from the farm, the very first column, where organic farmers were slightly less satisfied. But for relationships with family and neighbors, overall quality of life, organic farmers were about 10% more likely to report feeling satisfied than conventional farmers. And then for our last comparison here, we asked a couple of questions about health status as well. We asked if anyone in the household had health problems that made it difficult to farm. 15% of organic farmers had a health problem like that compared to 27% of conventional farmers. And we also found that less than a quarter of organic farmers had a pre-existing or chronic health condition compared to over half of the conventional sample. But again, remember, our organic sample is quite a bit younger than our conventional sample. So that's probably part of what's showing up here. For the next section of our presentation, I'm going to turn it over to Shoshana to go over farmers' views and opinions on some important issues that we asked about.
Thanks so much, Andrea and Doug. So we're going to take a look at some of the issues looking forward that affect both farmers' ability to farm and also looking at their quality of life. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that many of us spend a lot of time thinking about is the future of farming and how do we both attract and retain the next generation of farmers. So we wanted to gain some insight into what this sample of farmers is actually thinking about for their future of their farms, and particularly about for the next generation. So we asked farmers and a series of questions, and what we see from this first bar graph is that a lot of farmers are actually concerned about the future of farming in their community within that area. About 64% are. And then next slide. Okay, great. But what we see is some interesting results when we ask them about whether or not they would encourage their children to become farmers. And here we see this really interesting flip in that 64% say that they would actually encourage their kids to be able to become farmers. And we actually do see a little bit of worrying about whether or not their kids can afford to take over the farm or not. So this is a little bit more mixed in some of the views. Okay, next slide. Okay, and again, because what we're trying to really also do within this analysis is understand organic and conventional farmers, we see that organic farmers are just slightly more concerned about the future of farming in their area compared to conventional farmers. But it's really interesting when we look at the questions, we see that organic farmers are actually much more likely to encourage their children to become farmers than are conventional farmers. And they're less likely to say that their children are going to be able to take over the farm, right? So these are both saying very positive things about who will the next generation of farmers and seeing optimism for the future of their farms. Okay, next slide, please. So we also asked a question about exit and retirement. And what we see is that smaller number of organic farms are likely to quit farming in the next 5 years. And again, related to age, we can also see that there probably is having an effect on this answer, but we see that more conventional farmers are planning to quit or retire farming within the next 5 years. But about equal numbers of both organic and conventional farmers have identified a potential successor to take over the farm in their future. So there's not really a major difference there. Okay, next slide, please. So we asked a number of questions about different attitudes towards a variety of different issues, and we're just going to share with you a small sampling of some of the questions that we asked farmers in this sample. But we asked farmers about their attitudes towards genetic modification of foods and crops. What's really interesting is that 80% disagreed that GMOs are good for farmers like me. And this is really not surprising considering the organic population and that GMOs are not really allowed in organic farming and certification. So this wasn't really surprising. We see a little bit more mixed attitudes, although overall generally disagree that genetic modification is good for agribusiness firms, right? So here we're moving from the individual for farmers like me to also thinking more generally about what is the agribusiness climate, which is really important for thinking about inputs and outputs. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the things that we talk a lot about especially within the sociology of food and agriculture, but also an issue that affects us across the food system is the increasing trends around concentration and consolidation in the food system. This is a trend that's happening both in terms of inputs, seeds, fertilizers, also within distribution, processing. This is an issue that came out really big in COVID-19. There's a lot of conversation that's been in the media around the concentration and consolidation within the meat processing sector, right, and how that affected the distribution and flow. So these kinds of issues really do affect our food system across the board. And so we also wanted to understand how are farmers themselves viewing agribusiness consolidation, again, looking at all the sectors of the food system, both in terms of food inputs to outputs, marketing, distribution. And what we see is that organic farmers do say that agribusiness exerts too much power in farm markets. And they're not very likely to say, they're more likely to disagree that agribusiness consolidations have actually helped their farm. And what's really interesting is we also asked a question about should government limit agribusiness consolidations? And this is really helpful for understanding about future program and policy work. And what we see is that 55% of organic farmers say that the government should limit agribusiness consolidations and be involved in these conversations. And we also have a substantial number that are mixed, but only 10% that disagree. Okay, next slide, please. And again, because we're also interested in comparing organic and conventional farmers, not surprisingly, organic farmers are much less likely than conventional farmers to say that GMOs are good for farmers like me. And what we see is that organic farmers are not significantly different than in saying that agribusiness consolidations have helped my farm. They're slightly actually less likely to say that it's helped it, but there's not a huge difference compared to when we say the government should limit agribusiness consolidations. Organic farmers are much more likely to be favorable and agree that the government should be involved, but it's also worthwhile in noting that over a third of conventional farms are saying that the government should limit agribusiness consolidations as well. So some interesting trends that we're seeing here. Okay. So we have a very long and extensive survey. We really just wanted to give you some nice highlights from today, but there's a lot of different questions that we're going to be analyzing that look deeper into the use of conservation practices, attitudes about water quality, a huge issue for our state. We also have data that we're going to be looking at about the reliance on off-farm work, childcare, as Andrea discussed, more information we have about health status and health insurance. And we have a substantial number of questions that actually ask specifically about OSU research and extension programming, also interest in wind and carbon payments and alternative resources. And as Doug mentioned earlier, we know that we have a substantial number of Amish and Mennonite farms in our samples. So really also trying to tease out how some of these subpopulations may or may not differ from each other. So we're also really interested in, collaborating with other folks to understand what you think would be really useful and helpful in your research. What are the questions that you have as we develop our list of products that we're going to be analyzing and then also writing about. Next slide. So at this time, I think we're really interested in hearing your questions and reactions, the degree to which these results surprise you, how much do they confirm what you know, where are you seeing things that might be different than what we're seeing in the data, how these things might be different regionally. One of the things that we are really also interested in is doing analysis that looks at how different parts of the state are similar or different for different issues. And most of all, we'd really like to thank all the farmers who participated in the farm poll, and also all the associations and organizations that helped to promote this, and to our extensive team, which includes Hope Hunter and Jerry Mary Hirschberger and Tiffany Woods for helping us with this data analysis. So I think at this time, we're ready to open it up for questions and discussion.
So if you have a question, you can either unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it. We're a fairly small group today. Or you can punch something into the chat box and I can share it for you if you don't want to unmute.
Hi, this is Steve Coleman. I have a question. Appreciate the presentation. It's very good information to know. I think we all need to be grounded a little bit more in terms of the context of conventional and organic farms. So thanks for all the hard work. I know it's a big task. This is not related to the information per se, but just a general question about survey approaches in Ohio and the concern of survey burnout. And it seems like, well, it just seems like you had really good response rates, and I'm just kind of curious if you have any thoughts. I've been asked a couple times in the last couple months, this is why this is on my brain, from people that I will say are natural scientists and not, asking about farmer surveys. And I've tended to say, well, burnout's a real thing, and I'm not sure that farmers need yet another survey. But I don't know. I'm just looking for comments in terms of why you all have been successful, and do you think, is there any evidence to suggest that farmer survey burnout is higher than it otherwise would be, say maybe 5 years ago?
Great question. Something I spent a lot since I've been surveying farmers for, excuse me, my throat's going, over 25 years. It's clear that through time, it's gotten more and more difficult to achieve the same response rates. That said, when one implements a survey using sort of state-of-the-art techniques, and there's some strong science and research, meta-research on what works and what doesn't work in survey research, and when one is asking questions that are relevant to the respondents, so they see themselves, they see value in responding, it's a lot easier to get better responses. I'd say half the battle is designing the instrument and as an art form as much as anything else. I've been working on one with Cassie here, so she knows how many editions we've gone through. But it's not so straightforward if you haven't done it before, how to write a question that actually will work. And so a lot of the design and the implementation process, getting those things right can help. That said, if it's not something you can convince farmers is going to benefit them in some way, if you can't make a case as to why they should participate, you're always going to have an uphill battle. I think the higher response rate among organic farmers is partly driven, given that they got the exact same instrument, by them seeing more benefit to themselves in telling the organic story. And we pitched it to them that way, that we know very little about organic farms compared to conventional. And this was their chance to kind of put on record some good information about what's going on and what their concerns are. Let me just say one more thing. We see the Ohio Farm Poll, and we've not talked about the statewide sample, as potentially being a vehicle for us to collectively at Ohio State coordinate our surveying and information gathering. And we would like to do something that recurs on a regular basis, maybe every other year, and would be, I think in the future, using a model where we could partner with folks who maybe don't have the expertise or time or resources to do that kind of high level survey work, but to talk about getting space on the Ohio Farm Poll and collaborating to gather data for different projects and different researchers or our extension colleagues who might have questions where a survey or a statewide survey could be useful, or a in-depth survey with organic farmers could be useful. So we funded this internally off the side of my desk, and trying to demonstrate the value in having a well-done statewide survey, both for organic and conventional populations, is a big goal of ours.
There was a question on the chat wondering if the organic farmers in the survey were in fact certified organic. I believe they were, but I'll let you, one of you answer.
So we drew our organic farm sample directly off the USDA list of certified organic operations in Ohio as of December 2019. Now that list includes who certifies them, and something like 95% of certified organic farms in Ohio are certified through OFA. But there are there's others that are certified through Pennsylvania, Michigan, or national organizations that are also in the business of certification. But this would all be people who show up as having current USDA certification status. We would not catch people who use organic practices but aren't going through the effort to get certified by USDA.
Thanks. We had another question, which Shoshana kind of addressed on the chat, but asking about just other demographic differences you found between the organic and conventional farms. I'm going to expand on that a little bit. Of course, they seem to be, in general, younger, but any differences in gender, race, anything like that?
I think in the chat, there's been a little talk about gender. We got very few female farmers in the conventional sample. We have more, significantly more in the organic sample. But it's still, as is often the case in survey work, that when one person fills out a survey, it's often the person who identifies as the man in the house. When it comes to farm operation, it's also the case that in Ohio agriculture, we have relatively small representation of diverse producers. We would expect that to be higher in the organic sample, but we didn't include a race question in part for that, so I'm not sure we can tease that out. I think the big striking thing which we've highlighted is how young the operators are on the organic operations compared to conventional. If you weren't aware that the average age of the Ohio farmer is 58, and as in our sample, the majority of farmers are over the age of 55. In conventional agriculture, that's not true at all in organic farming, but it definitely is part of the story of both samples. When you have a big fraction of your respondents who are, even 65 and older, they're going to be in a very different life stage and very different challenges and opportunities than a lot of people who are relatively early career. And the organic industry is much more an early career kind of industry.
How much of a role do you think that age difference made in like some of those attitudes? Like, do you feel like that would make them naturally more optimistic if they were a little younger?
To be young. I forget what it's like, but we have not parsed that out since we really, these data are hot off the press. We spent our summer and early fall cleaning the data before we could share them, and then ran some initial patterns. But we're right now diving into that question about what is it about age? I think the presence of so many plain farmers in the organic sample is also a factor in explaining, say, how much they'd encourage their children to take over the farm, how optimistic they are, what they're concerned by, how stressed they are by things. And to do that right, as a scientist, we need to begin to look at things at the same time. So controlling for all these different things simultaneously and see to what extent organicness, direct marketing behavior, age, experience, perhaps affinity with plain farming communities might be things that really help tease apart the differences we see in the answers people give.
This is Steve again. I have a question about the slide. I thought it was really interesting about transitioning to organic and how the percentage of growers is very different, but in terms of the number of acres, we in kind of amongst some of the folks have tried to use the number of acres transitioning to organic is, a large justification to the college about why we should be prioritizing this and giving organic more credence and more attention than we have historically. And I'm just kind of curious if there's more to the story than that. Like I haven't really looked at the numbers to know. I assume you can find from the organic database that number of operators and maybe even acres transitioning, but I'm just kind of curious is there more to be said about that? I think that's such a key part of why, if somebody, whether a county educator or whoever, comes forward and says, why should I care about organic? It's a big piece of justification for that. And just thinking about, our jobs at Ohio State and keeping ahead of the curve and trying to anticipate in lots of ways where agriculture is going in the state. And this is, kind of taking cues from this survey as a important thing. So anyways, I'm just asking a general question about, is there more to be said about transitioning acres in the state?
I think there is, Steve. I think I did the back of the envelope calculation. Now all of our numbers are plus or minus 3 or 4%. So if I say 6% of producers are transitioning in, that could be 2. In worst case scenario, if we just happen to get a strange sample, but even 2% of 80,000 roughly farms is going to be 1,600 operations. There's less than 1,000 certified organic operations in Ohio. So we know there are a lot of people out there that are considering organic as a strategy to deal with the sorts of stressors that we've been talking about. And that the sheer scale of that interest and level of activity is at least on the scale of what the existing organic sector looks like. And I think that's justification for perhaps thinking about the growth and expansion of that sector as part of what we can deal with in our research and extension portfolios for sure.
So just to underscore what you just said, let me make sure I heard it right, that we about 1,000 organic producers now, and that's going to essentially at the very least increase by a factor of 2, right? I mean, it's
yeah, if everyone is successful and sticks with it and survives the transition and becomes certified and produces. But it definitely is looking like a sector that's in growth mode in Ohio. There is a survey that the USDA does of organic producers, and they publish those results every few years. And we happen to have 2019 as the most recent data. They pivot off of the Census of Agriculture, where they ask a question about organic and then go back to people. That has it's differently precise. I'd say in some ways it's more accurate at estimating the total acres and things, which we did not ask. And so we haven't brought that in. It just came out 2 months ago. to our thinking about the organic results. But I would align those two data points, our survey and the organic census data, and get a much more precise estimate of how many acres we're talking about, and how fast it's growing.
One more question in the chat here. What about the use of sustainable practices? Did you study that at all, or are there some other studies that are kind of looking at that?
So we didn't report on it here just for time, but we have a page of questions that reflect the use of a variety of farming practices that people might associate with sustainable agriculture or moving towards greater sustainability. Things like cover crops, with some details about what cover crops they raise, diversifying crop rotations, the use of some standard best management practices or farm management techniques. And we'll be able to compare those by region, by organic or conventional status, by type of farm. One of the things I heard, this isn't really an organic issue, but when I chaired the task force on water quality a couple of years ago and went around to focus groups in the state, is how different the conversation, how the water quality and sustainability conversation is present everywhere, but a lot of our data and focus has been on the Northwest. So we do think understanding how ubiquitous or common certain practices are, how concerns vary, what the issues are for what kinds of farms for each of the regions of Ohio is going to be a really important thing. And we've held off releasing that yet because we want to get that right. And I think with organic, you are going to see much higher incidence of people using all these practices because organic farmers rely on some of these techniques to manage soil health and fertility, weed pressure, pest and disease pressure. And so we know from other work that we've done that it's pretty standard to use a lot of sustainable farming practices to be certified organic.
So can I also just follow up really quickly? It's really interesting when we talk about sustainability and what is sustainability and the multiple dimensions to sustainability. And I think oftentimes we're most comfortable with the environmental components of sustainability. And one of the things that has really been important within alternative agriculture and folks in programs like SARE, right, is thinking about it's not just environmental, it's also economic, but also social sustainability. And how do we understand what is social sustainability? And increasingly, there's really been much more broad recognition that economic profitability does not lead always to better quality of life and to ensuring that the next generation of the farm is, the next generation wants to take over the farm. So our survey was also not only designed to capture some of those environmental sustainability questions that Doug just went over, but also these social sustainability questions that are much more, sometimes difficult for us to operationalize and to understand, but are critical if we want to talk about workforce attraction and retention within the food and agricultural sector and think about who is the next generation of farmers. So that's why we are also, really trying to push and talk about some of these other issues and how the farm household intersects with the farm enterprise, because unless we really reconcile with those, we're not really going to be able to achieve sustainability in its fullest form.
It's a really important point.
Yeah, thank you. I will entertain one more quick question if someone has it, but we're about out of time.
This is Eric up in Fulton County. I'm an extension educator up here. I know there's a mix of farmers and state personnel and offer program. That sustainability question, it really, that is one of the most interesting conversations, and it all depends on what subset, what group is in the room. In my opinion, from a county educator perspective, because you can work, you can, if you get a group of conventional commercial farmers in the room, sustainable means a certain set of things, and organic one thing. And then if you get hardcore no-till folks in the room, sustainability equals no-till, and some other things. But it's that the audience that you survey or where you're having the conversation has a tremendous effect on how sustainable practices are quantified. I think a no-till guy would discredit organic. The quickest thing a no-till guy would discredit is row cultivation, you know, right, for weed control, and yet it's one of the most necessary practices in an organic operation. So it's just interesting things. Shoshana put a question in there. I find the data, I think someone brought it up, and I was in and out of the conversation, but the age thing is a really good thing to bring to light, the average age of an organic farmer versus conventional commercial farmer. So I appreciate that data point, and also knowing the amount of transition. Steve Kallman and Brian know how, I don't know if I'm adamant yet, but I'm with Steve Kallman on there needs to be more personnel in OSU working on organic, whether it's outreach and extension, whether it's research. They're just the amount of acres that are transitioning with large conventional commercial farmers. It's coming. So the edge may have been taken off in the last 90 days, but if you would have taken the last 90 days off of the market rally, I know of a handful of farmers talking about transition because, you know, everybody else is in their pocket.
Thanks, Eric. This is good food for thought and maybe a good place to end today. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But I do invite you all to check out the future website or the future webinars that are coming up, and that can be found at offer.osu.edu. And we will have this recording up if you want to review some of these numbers. They kind of came at you pretty fast, but thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to our wonderful speakers, the great discussion we had afterwards. And hopefully we'll see you all at a future webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.